Nau mai, hoki mai ki ada fold, imehine ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. Welcome to the first part of a two-part special. I'm joined by Glen Kyne. Kia ora, Glen.
Kia ora, Duncan. Good morning. Good to be here. What a time to be recording.
Yeah, well, I'll give you a bit of background. So we'd planned, a few weeks ago to do a two-part end-of-year special wherein we would rank the sort of 6 big local media companies on a vibe-based perception.
Highly scientific.
Highly scientific, vibe-based perception of how they performed in 2025. That's part one. And then part two, we are going to pick the top 5 global media. It's not quite companies because one of them is a subsidiary of a bigger company, but the big consumer-facing global media brands that we think performed best in 2025. So we're already excited about that. It's exactly the kind of thing that Glen and I like to nerd out on this podcast. And then Saturday, news breaks that Netflix has won the sort of what was previously a relatively slow motion bidding war for Warner Brothers Discovery, which is just an enormously impactful thing. So what we're going to do, part one is actually about the local media companies, and we will be talking about this acquisition right throughout both episodes. It is that impactful. However, what we'll do right now is just do a quick 5 minutes kind of reaction to that, because it's such massively, it's just impossible to overstate just how big this could be and probably is in terms of a piece of media news. Glen, you texted me, I think it was sometime Friday or Saturday.
10 Friday night, I think.
That's right. Never stops. What was your reaction to this? Because it was, for a while, it seemed like it was going to be Skydance Paramount that was in the box seat here for a variety of reasons. But Netflix seems to have, who previously, I think, Tetsuya and Eidos talked about, Netflix being builders, not buyers. They have stayed largely true to that, not big acquirers over the years. This is an enormous acquisition, $85 billion the reported price for the assets of Warner Brothers Discovery. What did you make of it?
Well, first of all, that price. So let's just talk about that for a second. $85 billion, including $10 billion worth of debt. So that's 143 billion New Zealand dollars. So that gives Netflix a total debt of $85 billion now. That's more debt than any other standalone media company. The annual interest payment on that, should this deal go through, is $5 billion per annum. And to make the deal happen, Netflix haven't drawn into their own cash reserves. They have taken a bridging loan, and it's the biggest bridging loan in US history at $59 billion. So, that is clear intent for a company that really wanted to win this deal. And I think that's what surprised me. Like you, I thought this was going to be a Skydance Paramount deal. All of the signaling coming out of the Ellison family was that there was an easier path through, ongoing competition inquiry that actually Skydance Paramount would get this through. That started to change, though, about Tuesday, Wednesday last week, because David Ellison sent a letter to the board of WBD suggesting that the process was unfair that they were going through.
It's never a good sign.
Never a good sign. And so, look, for that reason, we've got a deal that's been announced, but not a deal that's closed. And we'll get into all of that later in the pod. But I think there's a lot more to play here yet. And I think while Netflix is sitting in the box seat right now, I don't think it's by any means a given that they are the eventual acquirer of WBD.
No, absolutely not. And it's a tremendously complicated thing because WBD owns a bunch of cable networks that Netflix has no interest in. Netflix, historically, part of its genius is that it's this one uncomplicated brand that just works wherever you kind of encounter it. And what they bought is something that was already a bit of a mishmash of brands. You had cable networks like CNN that have relatively limited digital video elements to them. You have HBO, this very prestige library, which is both a sort of an IP trove, but also just an incredible archive. But equally one that, because WBD was struggling to figure out what to do with it, how you hold that brand and honor its history and the value that contains, while also, being a much more mass product than HBO ever was. That gets even more complex when you're baking it into to a Netflix environment. Then you have the sort of legacy networks, cable business, which Netflix won't want any part of. I assume that they'll probably spin that off
from the deal. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So but even the excluding is going to be some kind of disentangling. There's all kinds of ongoing contracts globally in every different market. So the dream of this, all of that IP, all of that, these kind of millions of films and series, hundreds, thousands of films and series on Netflix or owned by Netflix with huge amounts of optionality in terms of what they do. That's incredible in terms of what it does in terms of cementing their power, but it's Hollywood has reacted with complete dismay because of the potential creative and business implications of it. What do you think about that aspect of it?
We'll get into the detail of each of the stakeholders, but even at a consumer point of view, I think it is. Obviously incredible to think of the depth and scale and volume and quality of content that you're potentially going to get. And the ramifications for that are enormous for any other content provider because the amount of attention that they're going to garner once they do this deal. But I think there are so many issues here that we need to get into, whether it's if you are an exhibitor or theatre owner, whether you are, in the craft in Hollywood, as you say.
But this is because Netflix has historically been somewhere between hostile and indifferent to the theatrical business.
Let's just say hostile. They're on record of saying it's not our model. And we'll come back into how they're playing through that at the moment with this deal. And then from a competitor landscape, you go, God, if this deal goes through, does the Trump government, for example, speed up a sale of TikTok to Skydance Paramount? What does that mean? Comcast are left holding nothing, really, with no dance partner. So the ramifications of this at a global level are amazing, let alone, as we'll talk about very shortly, what it means locally.
Well, let's use that as a segue into obviously a massive deal. We will be talking about it throughout because it touches so many of the companies, both locally and internationally, that we're discussing here. So. This is, as we mentioned, a vibe-based ranking, and I think that we'll go from bottom to top.
Okay.
We'll build up that way. I should say we both ranked these organizations separately. We haven't combined the ranking, and
we didn't share notes.
We did not share notes. So what we're going to do is we'll go off my ranking, because it's just for pure capricious reasons.
It's your pod.
It's my pod. And we will talk about where I ranked it, where Glenn ranked it, and what he had in the same rank. So, look, it'll make sense when we get into it, I'm sure, even if that sounded confusing. So let's, without further ado, I should say that the 6 companies that we are ranking in no particular order are basically the big 6 of New Zealand media. You have Stuff and NZME, you have RNZ, you have Mediaworks, you have Sky, and you have TVNZ. Collectively, they employ hundreds of people. I don't think there are any that we've missed out that have anything like that scale in terms of consumer-facing media organisations. Most of them, with one exception, have a big news component. All have large, effectively legacy businesses, whether that's radio, television, or print, and that's how they got to be big. We're going to start off at number 6. I've got RNZ in that slot.
Yeah.
So I'll make the case. Basically, RNZ, the recent ratings notwithstanding, where they sort of peaked over 500,000 for the year, weekly listeners after a long period of decline, and that is material and meaningful, and I don't want to discount that. But I do think 2025 has just been a really tough year for them. Probably the first big thing that happened was a 7% cut in their budgets. they, notwithstanding the fact that they had a big increase in budget in 2023, they did have a lot of technical debt. They have grown to sort of live within their new means rather than their old means, and to have a budget cut of that scale, and you can't really imagine it materially increasing in the next period of time. That's a hard blow. Not long after, they commissioned the Sutherland report, Richard Sutherland, a former senior RNZ staffer, to look into the sort of issues with those declining radio ratings. And, I think it was look, I've read a few of these kind of things, and I think it was one of the most readable reports you're likely to find, but it was pretty scathing too. And as a criticism of their on-air product, it didn't pull many punches. For people within and without of RNZ, a lot of it rang true, even if it was probably not as diplomatically phrased as they might have liked. And then out the back of that, certainly the commissioning of that, but before it landed, you had a round of voluntary redundancies, which are always pretty difficult to go through. So for those reasons, despite some upsides and the fact that they've had a very strong growth in their digital audiences, that's why I popped them in last place. You had them in fourth. Why did you kind of give them a bit of a bump there?
Yeah, I looked at all of the New Zealand media companies based on kind of what have they done this year to position themselves for value creation in the future. And part of the thinking there was, where's the market going? So where's the advertising market going? Where's government going? What does it look like into the future? So a slight hedge around what they've done versus what they've set themselves up for the future. So with Radio New Zealand, first of all, agree with everything you said. So Richard's not known for being shy, so a very direct report. But one in which RNZ directly responded to, and not only responded through the changes the way they've built their leadership team, but have also brought in changes at a board level. And so, you've got Andrew Schusterman, shout out to Schusti, deeply experienced, content guy, but deeply experienced, radio architect of knowing what's going to work, understands talent, understands how to put a show together. You got Brent Impey, obviously former group CEO of Mediaworks from many years ago. So they're building bench depth, which I think is a credible step to responding and reacting and making sure they've got the skills in place for the future.
That's true, and that's commercial experience, because I think for a while there it felt like in a related but very different way to Sky always felt like in the late period of the Follett era, it was this kind of castle on the hill.
Yep.
that didn't really much relate to the rest of the industry. And while RNZ's content sharing means that it has relationships elsewhere, it felt like it sort of seemed to act like it didn't have to deal with the same kind of forces that were acting on commercial. You do have to. There are certain things, whether it's to do with audience, or the sort of presentational aspects of what you're doing, where you have to kind of obey those rules. And so, I agree that those board changes will have been and will be helpful.
Yeah, and there's a few other things that I think are material and going to impact them in the future, although there's one thing that I think still needs to change. So on the positive front, their trust levels are still remarkably high in comparison to other news media, and I think they're maintaining that position, which is very, very important. I think also, despite all of the noise around not this radio survey because it was a good one, but prior radio surveys where they were declining, they have been building a very strong multimedia news organisation. They have grown significantly their digital platform, grown their podcast presence significantly. Their talent base, continues to change and migrate to the needs of today. But they are very well positioned from a multimedia platform to be kind of set for the future, really, to keep growing beyond radio.
I sort of don't know if I wholly agree there. I think they've set themselves up to be the country's wire service, and and that's where they claim to reach 80% of New Zealanders on, I think, a monthly basis. I'm sure they do. I just think that I think there are vulnerabilities in that. A, it's dominated by text-driven news, which isn't where preferences are going. But B, there are just system vulnerabilities there right now that they're largely leveraging the audiences of Stuff and NZME and Allied Press, publisher of the ODT, who all take and use prominently RNZ copy. It does seem to me that were any of them to kind of change tack there, that suddenly your claimed 80% reach goes away, and if your 80% reach goes away, your case for having the kind of funding that you do disappears in a flash. So part of me thinks that is a dangerously exposed position to be in for an organisation like that, whereas the likes of the ABC and the BBC, they go direct to audiences rather than through third parties.
That's a very good segue, thank you, Duncan, for what I was about to say next. First of all, I don't think either of those companies are about to give up that wire service, because in tough times receiving that content for free is very helpful for audience. So I don't think that's about to change anytime soon. But I do think there must be, I would think, have to be a discussion at the board level, and it's a commercially led discussion, right, around brand and going direct to consumer. And I was reading through the RNZ Charter because I was just wanted to familiarise myself with the challenges of going direct as a multimedia company versus, just building radio audience. And I think this is possibly the Achilles heel a little bit is the current charter, because if I just read out the 4 things very quickly, I think you'll get you'll pick up what I'm putting down.
Let's do it.
So first of all, as an independent public service broadcaster, the public radio company's purpose is to serve the public interest. That's number 1. Number 2, freedom of thought and expression are foundations of democratic society, and the public radio company as a public service broadcaster plays an essential role in exercising these freedoms. Third, the public radio company fosters a sense of national identity by contributing to tolerance and understanding, reflecting and promoting ethnic, cultural and artistic diversity and expression. And number 4, the public radio company provides reliable, independent and freely accessible news and information.
This is radio a lot in there.
Does. And I think that's the Achilles heel, right? So I think part of the issue going forward is, current government, change of government notwithstanding, that charter needs to possibly modernise to enable RNZ to go to direct to consumer. I also think something that is potentially playing out in the background, perhaps only in my mind, but possibly in the background, is the future of TVNZ, given the new chair. What does that mean? And we'll come back to talk about that. And is there a world where we've speculated on this pod before, where the newsroom of TVNZ and RNZ need to come together? Through that, the charter needs to modernise, and through that, the strength of direct to consumer needs to raise up.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not. It's not within the scope of this podcast, but you've seen a version of that with the BSAs accepting the complaint against the platform. There is a lack of modernisation and coherence ultimately in a lot of our legislation, full stop, but particularly around media. If you want to know more about the current state of RNZ, I interviewed its Chief Executive, Paul Thompson, a few months ago. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. Now moving on to my number 5, which again, we've got quite a strong difference of opinion on here, in fact, a bigger one. I had NZME at 5, which might seem like it doesn't kind of mesh with their results, which were pretty strong, and particularly given the difficult market that we're in. And on some level, because whereas you had them at number 2,
yep.
I think the reason I say that is, one is that they just had this torrid year, right? It started with some really, really painful redundancies that saw it get rid of a raft of really senior and qualified reporters. People like Jamie Morden, who had been around a long time, who had real domain experience, and that, that just hollows out the kind of credibility of an organization, I think. And what they did that to introduce, essentially to swap print-driven talent for video-driven talent. Herald Now was set up in the aftermath.
Yep.
built around their Ryan Bridge fronted show that Shane talked about potentially moving on to 3Now's platform and potentially on air. We'll see about that, but I guess the fundamental of that is like this is an organization where, particularly around in terms of the Herald itself, it has this unresolved, to my mind, tension between, are you here to sell ads or are you here to sell subscriptions? And when you are a subscription product, which is largely built around text-driven news, you pull away the sort of a decent chunk of the top of your pyramid in terms of talent in that realm and replace it with a video product that is freely accessible, that is built around gaining ad impressions, you're lowering the quality of the product. And yet I'm assuming that you're going to be asking us for more money every year from now on for the product itself. And then we turn to the experience of reading the Herald. You can just feel the ad load. Every time you encounter it, it's just a really kind of straining at the seams kind of experience in terms of the volume of ads that bounce the page down, auto-playing video that sort of resets despite your kind of stated preferences. There's just so much stuff baked into the story that the experience of reading a story on the Herald versus on the New York Times, which we'll talk about in the second part of this podcast, is just vastly different. Yeah. And I don't, I think the bill will come due for that. I don't think that they have so much market power that or that consumers in New Zealand are so oblivious that they will just accept and continue to pay for a product where the actual experience of it reading it is that, it's honestly diabolical at times, especially when, stuff is free and a better experience. It just is. RNZ is free and a better experience and like a vastly better news product a lot of the time as well. Not that the Herald doesn't have, probably 6 of my favorite 10 writers on staff or contributing, but there is a limit, I think, and they are. I don't think they're approaching it. I think they're through it. And you can see that in their subscription revenues, which are sort of flat to slide, to potentially even sliding. And there's all kinds of reasons to believe that NZME has hope for the future. A lot of them to do with One Roof, and I think that there's still time for them to figure this out. I actually think that this is without getting to the boardroom coup, or attempted coup that was really traumatic for the company, but ultimately has played out in a way that's at worst neutral. I think that they've got Stephen Joyce as a very smart and engaged chair. Jim Grennan certainly doesn't seem to have been the agent of chaos that people were fearing in terms of the news side of the business. The way that they managed and ultimately recovered from that, I think is actually a really impressive thing. But ultimately, there's a whole radio side to the business and One Roof side to the business, which has done very well. And I think part of the reason that RNZ's weak, for example, is that Newstalk ZB is a juggernaut and it's really well run, and it's just got this thing that feels quite, if not unassailable, that certainly it's what the biggest bulk of the talk radio audience wants. So on that basis, I think that 2025, from a product point of view, and all these companies are ultimately product companies now, it feels shaky to me. But you had them as having the second best year.
Yeah.
Explain.
Well, first of all, their financials, despite, as we talked about, as you mentioned at the top, pretty good, really, in the circumstances.
Agree.
Again, I'm going to think about value creation here and what it means for the future. So the boardroom spill that occurred, horrible for everyone internally and externally. Like, it was hard to watch, right?
It's great to talk about.
Great to talk about, but you just knew how difficult that was. Is that over? Who knows? Jim Grennan's pretty close to 20% of the company now. Is he wielding that influence? I mean, there's things we just don't know. And if that decision around, as you talk about, preferencing advertising over editorial is unresolved at the boardroom, does he, simply invest more to take control of that situation? He's pretty clear he wants the editorial to improve. That was very evident during his letters. And the great thing about being a public company, is every quarter you've got to front up and you've got to deal with these issues and challenges. And there's no question that what became prevalent during that boardroom spill was, the belief that editorially they were underserved around the quality of the product and what that was driving for their subscription revenue. So I think the spill, if you like, has done them a favour in probably clarifying that. We haven't necessarily seen the outcome of that yet, but I feel we will. And I feel the thing that's playing out in their favour, which you're not going to be happy with, Duncan, is the market. I think we've seen rock bottom in 2025. I really do. And I think there is going to be a recovery of forms. And when I say recovery, I'm a little bit careful about that. I'm not necessarily saying that there are going to be tons more advertising dollars flow into the market for local media, but I don't think there's going to be tons of money flowing out. I think we're going to have a stability and actually a bit more confidence from advertisers to start spending again. And NZME are going to be the biggest beneficiary of that. They are the biggest, most diverse advertising media company with more fingers and more pies than anyone else. And if they're seeing the benefit of that through their financials, it gives them the time to really get the editorial and potentially invest in their editorial product to get it right and back to where it needs to be. So I think that's a big thing. I think the other big thing is, it was February this year, I think, February or March, I can't remember, but I think we first talked about the fact that there was a strategic review happening with OneRoof. In the August result, they talked about that was ongoing. They will have to be making announcements pretty soon around what their decision is on that. Whatever it is, it has to be value creation for their shareholders. And I think that's going to put them in a very, very good position in terms of either realising value immediately or driving share price improvement for the company. Again, very, very good. And I also just think that the diversity they have in their business model, when a market's down, but when market's up and you've got diversity in your business model, it just gives you a lot more optionality in terms of the investment decisions that you're going to make. And so I think that they, you said it, they are well run. They've been in a tough position. They've had a lot of difficult things happen to them this year, but they've got a great asset portfolio. They've got choices, and I think they're going to see their income go up, which is going to give them more choice in 2026.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're, I can't really dispute any of your analysis, and certainly mine's more of a sort of a reader, consumer-based analysis than a fiscal one. I just think that at some point, people are going to who are experiencing the product the way that it is. If the economy improves and there's more ad dollars flowing in, I just don't feel like it's at the limit. So there might be some improvement on price paid, but that's so even in a positive market, so much of that flows offshore, and that ultimately sets the price for audiences that, are they going to try and put more in? I don't even know if the system can take that. And I do think that, for example, Business Desk, which they acquired, I thought it was a great and far-sighted piece of business in 2021, it doesn't feel like, if you're a subscription-driven company and that is your sort of North Star, you'd be investing more heavily in that. I think Business Desk is a fantastic product. It's a really high-value audience. It, under Victoria Young, it's really well edited conceptually. That they did the CEO index recently. That's a really smart piece of work, but it's broadly a similar size, and that they don't seem to be kind of pushing ahead with that. It just sort of seems to be a thing that they own, and that's the best and the worst thing about NZME is they operate these brands relatively autonomously. So I just have fears for what a recovery might be a Pyrrhic victory in some respects.
Yeah, my prediction is that will change as soon as the outcome of One Roof is decided or made known, because I think it cleans up or clears up where capital will be allocated for a return, and potentially in businesses that are no longer directly connected. And so I think that opens up a lot of opportunity. And I think, look, frankly, what NZME, like all media companies, have been doing over the last 12, 24, 36 months is managing their cost base incredibly tightly, limiting investment because they've had to get through this economic downturn.
Let us move on to my number 4. I had TVNZ here. You had them at 5, so fairly similar. This was Jodie's first full year in charge, Jodie O'Donnell as CEO. They obviously 2024 was a brutal year, a very significant downsizing and the end of some really sort of famous brands. What we saw this year was, you didn't have downsizing to the same effect. It was more of a sort of attritional kind of shrinkage that went on. I think they're down under 600 staff now from 750 a couple of years ago. The main thing was they swung around back into profit, which is, again, in this market, quite an extraordinary thing to achieve. And they made $25 million. They also announced that, from, I think it's roughly midway through next year, they'll be turning on a new digital platform, which will allow them to do pay-per-view. That's a big bet. Completely unknown whether that will land with consumers or not. But what the platform does more broadly is it'll be better from an advertising perspective. It'll allow them to spin up, more fast, free ad-supported television channels, and just generally it'll be a much more sophisticated platform for in TVNZ Plus for their consumers across a whole bunch of different metrics. So, in some ways, a sort of a steady as she goes year, but underneath it, some things which I think are quite impressive. They did lose the cricket rights, which have been a real sort of, it was a gift that fell into their lap, but you still have to figure out what to do with it. Slightly offset by getting some rugby rights in the most recent New Zealand rugby deal, albeit NPC, which isn't quite, it's certainly not the big show. They won the FIFA World Cup rights, which will be the first big test of that new platform. But broadly, their sports portfolio is much less premium in an ongoing sense than it was when they had that big trove of rights gifted to them by Spark Sports. That said, for a business that is entirely reliant on advertising at the moment, that has no subscription revenues to kind of work around it, has the sort of structural decline of linear TV audiences as the sort of standing and likely endless problem. They are managing this really difficult hand pretty well. I thought you had them at fifth.
So operationally, I agree. I think Jodie's done a phenomenal job. The company has weathered a difficult time pretty well, and there's no question that the strategy, in my mind, that they're embarking upon is the right one from a sort of standalone operational standpoint. My question is more now a much bigger strategic question around where to from here, and can they navigate successfully, particularly on the back of the news over the weekend with Netflix.
So explain to me how that will impact TVNZ specifically.
Well, if you just, we have to guess a little bit, don't we? Because we don't know exactly how the model will roll out. But on the assumption in a market like New Zealand, where Netflix have complete market dominance from a streaming point of view, and the WBD streaming output at the moment is via relationship with Sky. So you'd assume that post-deal closure, content comes back, goes on to Netflix. Netflix then, if they're getting 2 or 3 hours of attention a day, go up to say 3.5, 4 hours, I'm making these numbers up. But the point being is they're just getting more and more attention. The value offering to a consumer is just better and better. That's eyeballs not on TVNZ or not on TVNZ Plus. So the potential to accelerate the structural decline.
Well, and not only that, right, but they have, Netflix has now turned on advertising in most markets. It hasn't done here, but what kind of a competitor do they become with their sort of matchless technology and probably an increasingly high-value audience that they can then go take around agencies and tell a story that is in many ways superior to TVNZ's, which has previously been something that is an ad-free environment.
Yeah, and their ability to, again, through scale, to just acquire marquee content, to take it off the market, so it just becomes such a juggernaut. So that's a long-term risk, but in the meantime, you've still got the strategic challenge for TVNZ to navigate, to go, how do we go from being a linear broadcaster to a profitable streamer? And there's only a limited amount of cash that the company has on its balance sheet. It's been protecting that, but actually the cost of competing, I'd argue, just went up over the weekend, and the potential cost of capital that needs to go in to be able to compete against Netflix just became harder. I think that the structural issues that exist on legacy TV are going to continue and potentially accelerate on the back of this deal. I think in the next couple of years, from a sports point of view, what Sky have done by strengthening their business in the last 12 months means that they, have the ability to ensure TVNZ does not get any sports rights that Sky doesn't want them to have. So I think that's a very real battleground that's going to be a challenge for them. And I think just overall, the size of the market appears to still not be growing. And that just means that there's constraint. I think the rugby rights are amazing that they've got them. I think it's going to be really good for TVNZ. Question how much monetization they can get out of that. I think the bigger beneficiary is going to be the New Zealand Rugby Union in terms of building affiliation with the game. I think FIFA is a great deal. Remains to be seen. Can they make money out of it? We'll see. So I think there's just such big questions, Duncan, around TVNZ. And as I say, their strategy of what they've been doing is right, but the world of which they're executing that strategy and is changing so quickly and creating so much uncertainty that they can get it right.
It's a great point, and even down to their ownership. They've long been state-owned, but National and ACT look like they'll be campaigning on a platform of recycling assets, as the euphemism goes. TVNZ are sometimes in and sometimes out of that. How much value you'd get for it will be very much in the eye of the beholder, but there would be bidders. And so that adds a sort of another layer of uncertainty. It wouldn't necessarily even be bad for TVNZ, I don't think, to be sold. Yeah. In some ways it would be positive, but it certainly lacks the certainty that most people want.
Well, and also, the interesting thing about the Netflix-WBD deal is it potentially reduces the amount of potential buyers on the one hand. I do wonder, though, whether there is an opportunity for, and I don't know whether TVNZ and Netflix have had this conversation, but to replicate, the trial that Netflix ran in France by partnering with TF1, the big broadcaster. That seems to me a good option for Netflix and TVNZ in this market because, again, Netflix have streaming dominance. The only available audience for them to get is the one that they don't have, and that's really with TVNZ. And so by bringing those partners together, is that an option in the future for TVNZ?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fraught one. You can definitely see the upside. You can also see that might be the end of your own platform. It is also the kind of thing which Netflix 6 months ago might have been very intent on, and now it's going to be digesting this enormous acquisition probably for the rest of the decade. Yeah. Will they still have the sort of resource and attention to put into projects like that when they have this much bigger pie in front of them? We will see. Moving on to number 3. This is our first area of agreement for the day. We both had stuff in at 3. Do you want to start us off this time? Why did you have them this high?
Following some of your points you made around NZME, the product's good, the editorial's good, quality's good. The sale of stuff digital to Trade Me, I thought was a genius deal. Very, very clever.
50% of trade, but still, yeah, a fantastic. And that's largely the point of why I had them so high, is you just couldn't find a better meshed acquirer than that. And I thought it was interesting in the podcast in partnership with PhD that we aired a couple of weeks ago. Rachel Bayfield, who's their head of innovation, talked about that sort of dream. I think it's an unrealized dream, but it still very much exists, of all of the intent-based data that Trade Me has, with the mass reach and the interest-based data that Stuff has. That is a kind of unique in-market combination. And while that will take a lot of work to get there, to have a story like that is tantalizing and plausible, that's unbelievable. Probably the deal of the year, even notwithstanding Sky's here.
Oh, and look, I'm sure it is, but that needs to be the number one priority. You just pour the money in. You need to realize that value, because it is going to unlock so much revenue for both companies into the future, and put Trade Me in a potentially interesting position where if they get that right, no matter what happens with OneRoof, Trade Me potentially have the data and IP advantage. And so that strategic kind of game that's playing out there is fascinating. The other interesting one for me is on the mastheads. Obviously, or not obviously, I'm not sure, for sale still.
Sort of a bit unclear. Which, and look, to be fair, selling things is a complicated business. Sometimes you want the sign out front in the yard, and other times you just want to do it with whispers. But it does seem to be that way. There were talks underway with NZME around this time last year. There is a true structural separation of the business that has happened. They now operate on different CMSs, for example. Shane even reported about a month ago that Joe Norris, who's the current sort of leader at Stuff Mastheads being the sort of paywalled print products, the Post, the Press, the Waikato Times, that she was interested in buying them. I've heard really conflicting things there. I've had it on very good authority that that's true, and I've also had it on very, very good authority that it's complete rubbish. Joe's denying it. We'll, internally apparently, but we'll see on that front. But certainly, the businesses which were very tightly bound a year ago are now relatively easily uncoupled.
And the neat thing for Stuff is they have options, and so that's what I think is exciting for them going into the future. There's a world where Stuff as we have known it looks very, very different in 12 months' time, should there be an acquirer of those mastheads. But you would hope that gives sustainability in the future to those mastheads, some investment in and some growth. I think the buyers are likely to be in New Zealand. It's hard to see a foreign buyer without them being able to get Auckland. Do you know what I mean? So,
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think that if you look at this year list, were we to have made it a year ago, we'd have had to have WBD on the list.
Yep.
They've been swallowed up.
Yep.
So it's one fewer. But this time next year, it's totally plausible to imagine Trade Me takes the other 50% of Stuff Digital, and that mastheads might have been acquired by NZME. So we might be one smaller once again.
But better off, actually, because of sustainability and investment and other things.
100%. And, what I want to say, part of the reason why I had them so high, and this is in contrast to NZME, is that I do think that their product, both from a sort of the editorial sense of what both the mastheads and digital are, is really, it's just well executed against the brief. I think Keith Lynch has done a great job in charge of digital, and I really like, I've said this before, but I think the way that he explains the thinking and the working there is really smart, and it hasn't been uncomplicated. They published the transcript of the police radio around the Tom Phillips case, and that is sort of remains a big source of tension. But I like the way he fronted up there, and I think in general, there is just a coherence and a solidity to the way those things are run from a consumer point of view that stands in contrast, even if they're leaving some revenue on the table versus NZME turning it up to 11. In the same way, I think that ultimately audience preferences, and you do see this a bit in terms of the Heralds versus Stuff's digital audiences, will prefer a sort of a more manageable level of advertising on their platform.
Agreed.
Let's move. One more thing, and this is a real shadow over them. The Troy Bowker purchase of their print site. We have no idea what's going to happen there, but the early signs aren't good. And it might be that just is more leverage. Even though the ComCom said he was not a related party, he might be a philosophically related party to Jim Grennan. And if that, maybe that it makes it more likely that mastheads get sold to NZME. I couldn't really comment on that, but it's definitely a cloud that hangs over Stuff's otherwise excellent year.
100%, and it's crazy genius. Very clever. Should it play out that way? But also, back to our earlier discussion on the quality of editorial, that move, should it happen with NZME picking up those mastheads through something like that being in the background, inherently is going to improve the overall editorial quality and output and volume for the Herald. So again, not necessarily a bad outcome.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say about that is, I think, and you have to look at the New York Times to see this, is that it always seems strange to me that Stuff launched with 3 different paywalled products, all of which need their own audience development strategies and are confusing to consumers. If NZME is pursuing a sort of a similarly weird version of that, where they have, you have your Herald subscription, but you also need another subscription for Viva and another subscription for Business Desk, and you can also subscribe to the Listener through that homepage. And would they have, 3 more subscription products? I think ultimately you just need to pick one, make it fantastic, in the same way that, the New York Times has bought The Athletic, but ultimately has baked The Athletic into most of its subs. It has its house of brands, the likes of Wirecutter. But, the Netflix strategy of have one fantastic subscription, get as many people on board as possible, versus have a lot of different products facing consumers, that would be my sort of fear, is that no one seems to be running into doing that work of consolidating the brands at either Stuff or NZME. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it doesn't seem to be happening right now.
No, my theory, and again, unfounded theory, was that they wouldn't maintain separate brands, is that it would be a little bit like the Media Insider. A sub-brand exist under the Herald subscription, and so it was very clear to the reader that it was the Post or the Press or the Waikato Times to be able to continue to attract those people through. Because I agree, the Herald has to be the brand that ultimately drives affiliation with audience.
Yeah, and then that's going to be a difficult thing for certain people to stomach. But as long as you've got your eyes on the prize and a plan that stretches over years, that can be managed. Let's move on to number 2 now. This is the area of our biggest disagreement, so I'm looking forward to getting into it. I have Mediaworks here. You had them all the way down at 6.
I'm sorry.
Your former colleagues will be appalled at you. I'll start off with why, and it really comes down to one deal. And
this is a large part of why we disagree.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that. So for the longest time, one of the biggest stories in media has been the AT contract, which is all the outdoor street furniture, advertising spaces, bus backs, everything else that Auckland Transport has. It's a massive, chunky, I think $300 million plus contract, and for a long, I think for 25 years it sat with oOh!media or its predecessors, and was a big part of their kind of value as a business. It had a torturous process with multiple sort of false starts or false ends, and ultimately was won by Mediaworks. And to win the contract, you have to make quite radically different terms to the ones that O had, but the sheer bulk and market power that it gives you, I think, is why I believe that, for Mediaworks as a proposition in market, the scale of money that naturally flows through them, and then opportunities that creates for the balance of their out-of-home business plus their sort of radio and relatively fledgling digital business is why I had them so high. It's like the NZ rugby deal to me, and it's, if you get it, you're in business, and if you miss out, you're challenged. It's of that scale within that industry. I think they've also got, now that they've exited news and they're just firmly committed to this entertainment, music, radio space, there's just a level of, we know exactly what we're doing here about that aspect of the business. They're not trying to be a bunch of different things, Rover notwithstanding. It just feels like that they sort of know what they're about. You disagree. Let's go.
Well, no, I don't disagree with the things you've said. I think if I just break this apart for a second, so the company has now structurally separated. There is the QMS business and there is the Mediaworks radio business. In market, those two groups of people are selling against each other, and I know for a fact and have heard that they are, in the same bid, competing with one another in the market.
That doesn't seem super desirable.
No. So you've got things like that happening. The bid for the Auckland Transport bid where they won, incredible, very big contract. There is a lot of value creation through winning that contract that actually goes to Auckland Transport, not to QMS. Now, we've talked before about the fact it is a very good contract because there are kind of ancillary benefits that come off the back of that in the market. But again, the benefit of that contract is not going to Mediaworks Radio, it's going to QMS. And so I think QMS is looking like a great company now with some very solid contracts, a lot of scale, that is highly likely, I think, to be sold in the near term. And to whom, I don't know, and how that transaction happens. I mean, there's speculation Channel 9 out of Australia is looking at, given the money it made after selling Domain. But I think that is lined up and ready to happen, which leaves Mediaworks Radio on its own. And Mediaworks Radio depends on how that transaction was to occur and how much debt Mediaworks Radio still has. But if Mediaworks is run just for cash to pay down debt, that's going to be a challenge.
That's a pretty tough place to work when that Mediaworks has had versions of that for decades.
Forever,
now.
Right?
But still, to be... to sort of think that you're on the way out of that and only to be put back into the debt prison again would be quite tough.
Yeah. Now, the flip side of that, those radio brands are incredible. The team running Mediaworks Radio are I'm going to say some personal bias here, but the best in the business. They know what they're doing. Very, very good at it. Very good at building audience. And I think they have moved a long way from thinking about those brands just being radio brands. They are content brands that they are now leveraging media as multimedia as much as they possibly can to build affiliation with audience. So I think the radio business is run, but just strategically, there's some big challenges there, Duncan. If QMS is sold, what does that mean? Is there a buyer for Mediaworks Radio? Is there not? If there was a buyer, I would have thought that would have happened by now. I think there are big strategic uncertainties in terms of what it looks like in 12 months' time.
Well, you persuaded me. I think I might have overshot that one, but we will see how it all plays out. That brings us to our number one, and again, unanimous choice for large media business of the year. It's Sky Television. If I should say, I interviewed Sophie Moloney a few months ago. I thought she was fantastic on the podcast, and you can find a link to that episode in the show notes. I think we will also be rerunning it over summer. Sky, and Sophie won CEO of the year at the Deloitte 200.
Well deserved.
Well deserved, but a media business, that's kind of almost shocking, in this era where media is considered the sort of sunsetting industry. And I think a credit to the year she's had. Do you want to take it away? Why you sort of have, agree with me on this one?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, very, very clear strategy over multiple years, kind of coming to fruition this year, really, with I term the strategy as kind of optimizing their their legacy business. So, extracting the maximum amount of value they have out of their box subscribers, both old and new. The acquisition of 3, which was brilliant, for $1 with, positive free cash flow forecast into the future once they have integrated that and executed against that. The benefit that brings them into the future with sports rights, and again, just their ability to compete with TVNZ is second to none, really, in that realm now. They navigated the satellite crisis, I thought, in a really probably rocky road to start with, but ultimately very transparent and good way.
It was a brutal start to the year because you also had Cara McGuigan, the CFO, resign, and they were the Optus issues were sort of front page of the Herald, and they were just basically like a long running. It wasn't like a one-off cataclysmic event. It was just something that played out for weeks on end. So the fact that they sit at this point with that in the rear view and all of this success is kind of even more remarkable in a way.
Yeah, that's right. Share price up, dividends paid, certainty around dividend payments into next year. So I think, incredibly well-deserved. And, as you say, a media company, who would have thought? But, Sophie's done a great job, and so congratulations to her. I think the funny thing, not funny, I messaged Sophie to say congratulations, and literally the day after, I saw the Netflix announcement. And, you just, who knows how that's going to play, but that becomes, I think, an item coming into very clear focus for Sky moving forward. Whilst they have, a very clear and, compelling sports proposition with the bundle they have, it's incredible. The entertainment proposition without WBD in the mix looks tricky, and potentially, whilst there are other studios out there, I'm not so sure those studios won't consolidate either to try and compete in the future, and so there's just going to be less options.
Yeah, and if you think about setting aside sports, I agree, sports an unreal year, getting a multi-year extension to the rugby deal at a significantly reduced price, basically returning to the track of pricing that they were on before that sort of, the Spark Sport-induced splurge with the previous contract. Getting cricket back, and the Olympics. They've just Formula One, just a banner year in terms of the sports you really want to own. You can't have to
the
own.
rise of NRL.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, really incredible year. But as you say, on the entertainment side, Sky has for a very long time been the home of HBO, and HBO, whether it's historically The Sopranos, the Game of Thrones, enormous, but lately likes of White Lotus and The Last of Us has been this kind of, they've built their marketing around every so often the show drops, it comes out weekly, and that's a huge part of the stickiness of Sky more broadly, but also for Neon as a product. You rip that out, I don't even know if Neon's viable without the WBD, the strength of that library. And so, you're right to say, she got about 24 hours to bask in the glow of winning, and then got this huge headache coming, albeit one that might well see those contracts renewed for a period of time, because there will be so much kind of mystery shrouding what is really going to happen here and how long it'll take. Yeah,
I think the real impact of, and again, big assumption, we'll come and talk about it, but assuming that Netflix are the buyer, the real impact globally in market is really going to be 2030, right, before it all becomes real. So, Sky's afforded the benefit of time. No doubt they will be looking, if it's true that the contract does end next year, they'll be looking to extend it to tie it in, no doubt, to a future when the ownership is clear of WBD. So they are afforded the benefit of time. One of the things they've done well, and I applaud them for, is, we talked about this, is they've launched their own channels recently. So they've taken output channels from studios, created their own. That means a better content experience for the consumer, a better advertising proposition as well. I think, continuing more along those lines. But ultimately, two big things, I guess, are important in Sky's future. One, tech debt. How do they consolidate platforms and get as much utilisation as they can? So, Neon and Sky Sport Now, for example, on different platforms. So can they bring that together? Two, in this world where consolidation is happening, actually is there a viable streaming entertainment solution in market in New Zealand?
Yeah. I mean, that's a scary question, but it does have to be asked is whether when you sort of, if you continue to lose out of the entertainment side of the business, whether it gets so thin that your proposition really isn't viable, isn't plausible almost to a consumer, and therefore you should really just focus on being the sports company. And that might not necessarily even be a bad thing. That might be a smaller, leaner, but more purposeful and potentially profitable company over time that partners more directly with sports organizations. And it's a while away from getting there, but there are sort of tremors on the horizon here. Even down to, that Netflix has bought a bunch of sports rights as it buys WBD, and it keeps saying we're not really in the sports business, but it has a slate of NFL games on Christmas, and it's wrestling, which isn't sports, or kind of is, but it certainly goes out live. There is a world where Netflix says, actually, we're going to really sort of dial that up, and that will be a different kind of confronting challenge for Sky.
Yeah. It's interesting with sport because they're building their dominance in sports rights in the future by building the entertainment program around sports to build the audience into the sport. So a very clever strategy, right?
Incredibly clever.
But, the things that are in Sky's favour, hugely more so than any other media company, I'd say, in New Zealand right now, the strength of the balance sheet, the strength of free cash flow being generated by that business, it gives them options. And as I say, they have some time here to figure this out.
Yeah, and advertising has been this kind of continual bright spot for them, and I think continues to be so. There's still a lot of room where most people are near their limits, maybe not TVNZ in terms of the digital space, but a lot of the other companies are kind of where, pretty close to their ceiling. Sky still feels like it's got more value to unlock there, and that's another reason to be optimistic about them. That is our first episode, ranking the years or the 2025s of the various large New Zealand media companies. We will be back next week to do the same again, or rather a slight variation. We'll look at the top 5 performances for the global, for the biggest global media companies. So come back for that. Thank you, Tia, here for recording us this week, and for Glenn for coming along. And ka kite anō.